This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I will be speaking with Dr. Steve McSwain about the nature of purpose in life and the cosmos, and the conversation will begin in a moment. This is my final show on the nature of purpose. Dr. Steve McSwain is my guest, and as I usually like to do, I like to have my guests take a few minutes to talk a little bit about their background, who they are, where they come from, what they believe in. So Steve, welcome, and if you could give a little bit of background on yourself.
Okay, thanks, Dan. It's nice to be with you. Appreciate the opportunity of sharing with you. I'm a native of Kentucky, born and raised right here in the state I'm talking to you from. I grew up in a Christian home. My father was a Baptist minister, and I grew up to follow in his footsteps and became a Baptist minister myself, and I did that for about 20 years, and then I got over it. In the last 20 or so years, I've been in congregational consulting, and I'm a speaker, a writer, and I write quite regularly and have a pretty good following of folks that like what I say about the changing trends in church life and in Christianity itself. We'll talk a little bit about that, I'm sure, in the course of this. But that's a broad sweep. I can fill in a little bit of the gaps here by saying that while I grew up in a Baptist minister's home, and ultimately followed in my father's footsteps and became a Baptist minister myself, I, very early in life, had the opportunity of doing what I say to people is necessary if they're going to find the purpose of their own lives. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. In that my mother was a travel leader, and she would plan these trips and take groups of folks around the world. So the very first trip I took to Europe was when I was about 12 years of age, and we went regularly every year thereafter somewhere. So by the time I graduated college, Dan, I had been around the world about 3 times. And so it gave me a perspective on life that maybe is not afforded to everybody, in the sense that I can remember, for example, being 12 years of age and standing in the Basilica of San Pietro in Rome, waiting with thousands of other Roman Catholics. And I didn't know who Roman Catholic people were. I mean, I had no clue who they were. For an audience with Pope, and he was Pope Paul, I believe, at that time. And I remember asking my dad, I said, "Dad, who are these Catholic people?" And I mean, there were thousands of them standing there in the Basilica. And I said, "Are these people Christians?" Well, that's a big question for a 12-year-old to ask. And I can remember on that same trip, it was a trip around the world. We were gone for about a month, also being in places like Kathmandu and seeing the Buddhist monks in meditation, and just being mesmerized watching them dance. So wondering who these people were and asking questions when I was 12, 13, 14 years of age about other religions of the world and what they taught and why they believe differently than we believe. And so that kind of early experience in my life, I think, sort of propelled me on a quest all my life, even down to the present, of trying to understand, the human family and why there are varying beliefs around the world among these different people if we're all one human family. So anyway, those kinds of experiences, I think, kind of came to a head for me, Dan, and I'll wrap this up, when about 20 years ago, I was serving the last church that I would ever serve as a minister, and my parents came to the community where I was living at the time and made their retirement home and ultimately joined that church. And on the very day that they joined, my father that evening suffered a stroke. And I preached his funeral a few days later in the very church that he had just joined, but never really got to attend as a member. And that experience of grief and sadness that just wiped me out over the next several months, my life kind of unraveled, and I left the ministry just in, confusion. And all the questions that I had asked as a young kid all kind of came to the surface again. And so that started my journey about 20 years ago, a different phase of it that's brought me into an entirely different place today in terms of my thinking about life, its meaning, its purpose, about religion. And we might want to talk about some of those things. But that's kind of a broad sweep of my life down to the present.
Well, before we get into purpose specific, let me ask you, you said that you were a Christian. Are you now a Christian? Are you an atheist, agnostic, a heathen, apostate, a heretic? What do you consider yourself?
Yes. I would answer yes to all those things.
Yeah.
I know that sounds contradictory, but I think that's one of the consequences of the journey that I've been on is that things are not clearly defined for me anymore, and I am okay with that. I mean, I don't have to know the answer to all these things, so I'm not trying to be evasive. I do consider myself a Christian, unquestionably so. I can't shake that. I really can't. Believe me, I've tried, but it's in my DNA. It's who I am. But it's my faith is at a different place today than for most of my adult life. But I would say yes, I'm an atheist as well, in the sense that I don't believe in a theistic God, and that's classically the definition of atheism. So yeah, I'm that. I'm an agnostic in the sense that I don't know about much of anything.
Well,
as I said, I'm okay with that.
Let me talk a bit about where you came from, because you said you were born a Baptist. I was raised a Missouri Synod Lutheran, and when I went to Sunday school from the age of 3 to 9 for 7 years, I was taught that God was inerrant, that everything had a purpose, that God was all-knowing, therefore you couldn't have free will. So ultimately, realistically, just logically, if God knows everything, that means he knows everything by definition, 100%. He knows what choice you'll make, 3 years and a Saturday from today when you at a stop sign, whether you'll go left or right. If that's the case, can there be purpose? And how were you raised as a Baptist? Were you raised as an inerrant God?
Yes, God was much as you've described, and of course, behind all of those statements and beliefs, Dan, that you've expressed as part of your own religious heritage, similarly with mine, is the assumption that God is this supernatural being, and we almost instantly think of him as a kind of generous male counterpart somewhere up in the sky. And I don't think about God that way anymore. But yes, that's how I was raised. So when you have this idea that God is a glorified version of the human with unlimited power, knowledge, and ability, then of course that leads you to a certain set of assumptions about your own life and about our purpose. And under that model, my religious tradition, similarly, because I'm very familiar with Missouri Synod Lutherans, I know what basically they believe. I've worked with many congregations under that stripe, so I know about Missouri Synod Lutheran, and the Southern Baptists were very similar to them, not quite as sacramental in their theology, but certainly similar in many ways. But we had this belief that our purpose in life was to please God, this being in the sky, because ultimately one day we were going to stand before Him. He was always a male, of course, and give an account of our lives. That was the theological construct. So the purpose of life was to please Him. Mm-hmm. Well, that's essentially true in all religions. When you believe in an external being, a deity, and in many of our ancient societies, even in Christianity as it's evolved, there's been this belief that we've got to please this being, this God. And I don't share that view anymore. I don't believe we're going to stand before God one day and give an account. So I'm at a different place when it comes to defining for myself and for human family what the purpose of life is. And for me, do you want to get into this now?
Sure, go ahead.
Well, for me, Dan, the purpose of life is to be who I am. It is to live fully into who I am, what I am, my potential as a human being. It is to become fully human. I already believe that we're kind of like divine beings on this planet, that we have a spiritual nature. That's who we are. We're not, as T.L. Chardin used to say, we're not, human beings having a spiritual experience. We're spiritual beings seeking to have a full human experience. To me, that's the purpose of life. And so my biggest struggle through my life has been not how to become more like God, but my biggest struggle is how to become more like me. And to live into my humanity, to become all that I'm potentially capable of becoming. And when I made that shift, Dan, that's when, for me, the greatest sense of peace and fulfillment came in my own life.
So, having looked up some stuff about you, it seems to me that you would consider yourself more of a spiritualist, not in the 19th century ghost, Ouija board sense, but a spiritualist rather than a religious dogmatist. Would that be correct?
That would be a pretty good, assessment. Beliefs, whatever they may be, whether you're a Christian or a Buddhist or Hindu or whatever they are, all of the religions have a set of beliefs. And beliefs to me are nothing more than our ways to articulate what is for all the human family in any religion, even outside of religion. I mean, I think that you don't have to believe in anything that's traditionally defined as a religion in order to have a kind of transcendent spiritual type experience. I can't help it, but one of the little books I remember reading a few years ago was by the philosopher in Great Britain. I believe it's France. Maybe it's France. What was his name? Comte de Sponville, who wrote the little book. That's the name of it. The Little Book of Atheistic Spirituality. Yeah. And he basically says in this little 100-page book that that the spiritual experience, whatever that is, this kind of other experience we have that we can't seem to put our hands on, but we can only try to describe. And as we try to describe it in the context of our own cultural situation, it takes on the form of beliefs over time. And even in Christianity, I think, my feeling is that what we have done is, Jesus, when he walked on this earth, and I'm assuming that everybody is pretty much in agreement that a person named Jesus once lived. Maybe. I know not everybody believes that still, but the majority of people, I think, believe that somebody whose name was Jesus lived. And but the people that had an experience with him, whatever that experience was, in time began to articulate it and to express it, and it took on the form of a set of beliefs, and a religion was birthed. That's how religions get birthed. But I would say that today, to answer your question, yeah, I've moved a little bit beyond that. It really doesn't matter to me what you believe, Dan, what I believe. That's ultimately only the shell. That at the heart of it is your experience, whatever experience you've had or I have had, that takes us to a deeper experience of our own humanity. And when that happens, and I can acknowledge that, that's where change takes place in people's lives, for the better, I mean. Our challenge in this world, particularly in the world that we're living in now, it seems to me, because it's the world I'm living in, it's the world you're living in, the challenge facing us, it seems to me, is to become more human in how we view all people, to recognize we are one family. We may speak differently, we may worship differently, but we are one family. And until we can get to that place, then we're going to get hung up on beliefs and philosophies and ways of living that are different from culture to culture. And we'll always have problems when that's the place from which we begin.
At the root of purpose, it seems that there needs to be an active agent, and so free will seems to be something that goes hand in hand with the idea of someone having their own purpose. Do you think that is so? And if so, do you think that because free will is scary, because if I make a choice to go A, B, or C, I may fail. Do you think that the scariness of having a free will and an ability to choose is something that trammels people in religion or politics or other modes of thought where they are stripped of responsibility?
Well, if I'm understanding your question, I do think that is why people cling, Dan, as they do, and I did at one time in my own life, to our religious systems, regardless of which system you're talking about. There's a lot of security in that. And I think that that's precisely the point I'm trying to make here, is that to live into one's full humanity as the principal purpose of human existence means that I increasingly take responsibility for my life. And yes, that does mean sometimes I'm going to blow it. I'm going to make decisions that are wrong. I'm going to be hurtful. I'm going to hurt myself or hurt someone else, intentionally or unintentionally, if that's what happens. So I think that in religion you have this set of beliefs that if people can sort of wed themselves to that, they feel like, okay, I'm okay. I'm following the rules. And to me, that's separating your responsibility to live fully into your humanity. So you're violating the principal purpose of life, it seems to me. Because this is where I am in my thinking today, and I realize that a lot of people are not at this place, and that's okay too. But if I'm hearing your question, yes, I think that for me, and I think for everyone, the more you can assume responsibility for your life, the freer and the happier you are as a human being. And so that doesn't mean you have to abandon your religion, but it means that you separate yourself enough from it that it's not, in Buddhism they teach detachment. And if I understand detachment, it's the same sort of thing that Jesus talked about when he said, deny yourself. Our propensity is to cling, to find identity, to hold on, to attach ourselves to that which makes us feel secure. And for Christians, of course, the afterlife and the judgment and heaven and all of that's what, they live for. And they have attached themselves to it. So I say to people, as radical as this may sound, and I'm sure it does to many of your listeners, but I say to people, when you're able to even let go of God, that I think is when you really find God, whatever God is. God may be you, me, our consciousness. I don't know what it is. But I think what I'm saying is, I think that when you can detach, that's ultimate. In Buddhism, they would call it enlightenment. In Christianity, for me, that's what salvation is. It's not getting to heaven. It's not avoiding the judgment or avoiding hell. That's not, to me, what knowing God or Christianity is all about at all. It's about becoming fully human, so that compassion, charitableness, consciousness, awareness of you, of myself, of the world, the oneness of everything, that to me is what enlightenment is, or awakening, or salvation.
Yeah, those things are also secular things. So I want to just drift away for a moment from a spiritual or religious question. I'm a writer. My wife's a writer. I've been in the world of art for 3+ decades, and I look at art the way many people look at religion. To me, art translates reality. When you read Moby Dick, you can find out about 19th century whaling, but Moby Dick isn't just about whaling in the 19th century. It's about deeper things, about humanity, monomania, obsession, lack of compassion, etc. In this day and age, in America, certainly in the West in general, and one of the reasons that a lot of fundamentalist Islam, for example, hates the West, other than things like exploitation for oil or whatnot, is that they look at us as decadent or hedonistic. All we want is happiness, sex, drugs, rock and roll, this kind of thing. And you hear people even who aren't into that just sort of blithely saying when they have a baby, well, the only thing I want from my child is to be happy in life. And I've often said to myself, I understand the impulse for that, but you can sit in a beanbag chair watching cable TV all day and someone can say that they're happy. To me, life should be about doing something more, like you said, maybe seeking wisdom, going out, doing things to make the world a better place. So do you think that when people here in the West and the U.S., that there's this sort of cult of just happiness, selfishness, hedonism, and that's one of the things that sort of retards people's ability to actually seek purpose and to go out and do the deeper, better things, to do good rather than just feel good.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Everybody is motivated by the desire for happiness. However they define that and describe it, that is the principal, I think, motivation of all sentient beings. I think there is one of the curses or the blessings of being a human being is that we have the capacity to reflect, as I've heard some of the others that I listened to some of the videos of interviews you've done with other people. That's to me, that's what distinguishes too the human being from other living things, is that we have the capacity to think and to reflect. And the mind moves in two directions. It's the mind the human mind either is reflecting on the past and rejoicing or regretting it, or it's thinking about the future and anticipating it or fearing it. And so we spend a great deal of our time in this perplexity over the past and the future that we can think about and imagine, and it robs us of the capacity to stay in the present. And so what I say to people is that when you learn to live fully into your own humanity, you're learning how to live into this very moment, which is really all we have, because when the future comes, it only ever comes as the present moment. And the past we can do nothing about. So the goal is how do I get connected to now? And when people get on this quest to become fully present in their lives, irrespective of their beliefs, their religion, or anything else, when this becomes their ambition, there is in that process, I think, the fulfillment, the self-fulfillment of the happiness desire that's in every human being. That's when it doesn't get mixed up, it seems to me, Dan, with the seeking of pleasure, which is, the thing that Islam reacts to in the West is our hedonistic impulses. And you do see it all over the West, because fundamentally people in the West are not thinking people to the degree that they are looking critically at what is it I'm seeking in my life and why. So we chase after pleasure, we chase after freedom from pain, as if you can be a human and not have pain, but we're always looking at ways to avoid it and to be free of it. So we seek after the wrong things, and because of that, we're always seeking. We're never satisfied. So when we're not seeking, which generally gets expressed in our thoughts about yesterday and what screwed up, why I wasn't happy with that pursuit, and then anticipating the next pursuit as we seek happiness, instead of learning that neither can satisfy you. It is learning how to turn it back so that I'm in the present. It doesn't mean you don't make plans. It doesn't mean you don't appreciate the past and learn from your mistakes. It just means that you are free of that, which is why in almost every religion there's this concept of forgiveness, because everybody needs a way to let go of their screw-ups in the past. Well, that's where theologically that's what it's all about. It's not about appeasing some God who's angry because we've screwed up. It's about freedom so that we can turn back to the real quest, and that is to live into our humanity in this present moment.
You just were speaking about seeking and how sometimes people are always seeking, and you was sort of slightly negative in that. But you also, on your website, I was seeing that you wrote that that curiosity might be life's purpose. So do you distinguish the idea from someone who's seeking, or do you see seeking as somehow being fatuous versus curiosity being some deeper probe into the essence of existence?
Well, I wrote that, and I think that's interesting that you. I appreciate the fact that you're digging around there to see some of the stuff I've written. Everywhere I go, and I do a lot of speaking across the country, as you might know, Dan, people ask me about the purpose of life, because I think we've created in our Western culture this notion, and we do this in religion too, that God has a grand purpose for your life and that your job is to figure out what that is. And then we get into all this stuff about the call of God upon some to become priests and ministers, and we've built a great theological construct over the years so that inside every religious system we have a way of preserving that system from generation to generation, and that's the call, as we refer to it. I think we've done a grave disservice to people, because what we now have in the West are people who are constantly struggling to find what is it that I'm supposed to do, as if it's a secret that God has a plan for my life, and I've got to kind of, snoop around like looking for a treasure buried in the ground somewhere. And once I find it, then I can be happy. It's another one of those silly quests that we're on. That's you don't in my judgment, and I used to believe this, and I used to teach this, but I don't anymore. So today, and I tell people, if there is some grand purpose, it's to follow your curiosity. Whatever the impulse is within you, the desire that draws you out toward your human experience, toward your full expression of your humanity, compassion and love and charitable living. If that's the kind of impulse that you feel in you and it's drawing you out, follow that. And it's usually expressed in our curiosity. It's usually in that which we're interested in. So that's why I wrote that. I don't, I'm not trying to say that curiosity is the great. I'm trying to give people freedom from this notion that there is some divine purpose, and your goal in life is to find it. And until you do, you're going to be unhappy. It's nonsense. Your purpose is to be you,
Mm.
and you have gifts and abilities and impulses and curiosities. Follow those, live into those, and give up this notion that you've got to have a big plan, planned out. And I think that if people will do that, they'll just be a whole lot freer and let go of some of the anxiety they live with.
Well, let me ask you about since you started out from a religious context. Number one, do you believe in the concept of evil? And if so, there are certainly people that their purpose, their curiosities would lead them towards evil things. I'm thinking about people who are killers, serial killers, or pedophiles, the Charles Mansons, the Osama bin Ladens, the Timothy McVeighs. Uh, can everyone be trusted, for example, do you think in society to that curiosity, that a willingness to be, to use the army expression, be all you can be? There are some people that you don't really want them to have free
following their
reign.
curiosities.
Yeah.
Sure, I think yes. There is in the human evolution. There are these. I don't know what the word is that I'm looking for here. There are these anomalies that are the consequence, maybe, of many, many different factors. Dan, genetics might be a part of it. Maybe the environment. I think it would be more genetic than environment, but maybe some combination of the two. That the consequence of which is, as you're alluding to, people have impulses and curiosities, that are detrimental and harmful and hurtful, not only to themselves, but to other people. I don't know that we know fully how that happens because what little I know, I'm not a criminal justice person who studied this philosophy and understands what factors play into making of a criminal serial killer or whatever. I just think it's a number of things that we have yet to discover. But I think the more we do discover, the more we realize that genetics plays a lot into this. And I think that as time evolves, we're going to understand these things more and more. And which is why I believe in medical science and everything else, we have to have a pretty open door to allow ourselves to research this more and more so that we can understand. But we have a lot of resistance to that in the West, that kind of research, biological research, because people feel like it's a violation, of we're going too far. We're playing God when we look into the genetic structure and try to manipulate genes or whatever. And I just think that we have to get over that. God has given us minds, whatever God is. We have the capacity to think and to reason. We need to understand these things. And gracious, think about how far we've come in our understanding of the human family. I mean, it's not been that many years ago. People thought that homosexuality was purely a choice, and that people chose to be homosexual. And if they made that errant choice, they can choose when they get their hearts right to make a better choice, to be a heterosexual. Well, we now know that's nonsense. That people, there's a small segment of every population through all the species. It looks as if it's true all up and down the line that there are people that are attracted to the same sex, and it has. I no more chose to be heterosexual than somebody chooses to be homosexual. It's just who we are. So I think the more we know, the more we're able to understand how to deal with with that which is different from what we typically find as the norm.
You had mentioned earlier Buddhism, and I've interviewed a number of theologians on assorted topics, including a Buddhist Lama and an Episcopal bishop. And one of the things that certainly here in the West, a lot of intellectuals sort of really get off on is talking about the supposed superiority of Eastern religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, Taoism, etc., versus, say, the Abrahamic religions. And one of the things that they posit as the thing that's better is the idea of being versus becoming. When you talk to a lot of people who were raised or practice what would be called Eastern religions or faiths, a lot of them seem to have this more, I'm part of the cosmos, I'm accepting, as if they're a water lily and not a human being. And there's a sort of a denigration towards the Western idea of making more of oneself, which seems to me more drawn or driven towards the idea of a purpose-driven existence. Do you think that the two ideals of being versus becoming can coexist, or do you think they are mutually exclusive?
No, I do think they can coexist, and to me, there's a lot that we can learn from Eastern faith traditions, and there's a lot that they can learn from the Western world as well. But the major difference between Hinduism and Buddhism and faith traditions like that, as opposed to Christianity, in my judgment, is that they've just been around longer. And when you really look at the basic tenets or beliefs, and Buddhism per se is not really a religion, as you know, it's more a philosophy. But like all philosophies, all experiences that we try to describe, they do take on a religious nature, and so for some Buddhists, it's become a religion. But I do think that to me, it's not an either or, that we just live into, as I have even described here, our just be, as opposed to becoming. To me, the becoming is living into that beingness, just understanding that, yeah, I'm different from a flower, I'm different from my dachshund dog, but there's a lot about us that's similar and beautiful. Just last night, for example, I was talking to a friend of mine who was over for dinner, and we were talking about my little dog, Hank's his name, and how, we wonder if you hurt a dog, if they remember. So, you hurt a dog, and then 10 years later, the dog sees you again and maybe growls at you. My feeling is the dog does remember, especially if you hurt him or her. The difference, though, between a dog and a human is that dog won't spend the next 10 years until he sees you again thinking about how he's going to get back at you. Humans can do that. So there are things that are similar. This is my point. There are things that are different. And it's the same in these religions of the world. There are things that are similar and things that are different. But to me, I think Mother Teresa expressed it best when back in 1989 or whenever it was, she was being interviewed by Time magazine. And they were talking about other religions, and Mother Teresa made famous the statement, I love all religions, but I'm in love with my own. And to me, that distinction that expresses right where I am in my own faith journey. I could not be a Christian if I wanted to. it's like I say, it's almost in my DNA. It's how I was raised. I can't. I've tried to divorce myself from it completely. I can't do that. It's who I am. I am Christian. I love my faith, but I also love other religions, and I'm learning from them. And the more I learn, Dan, the more interesting it is to me how similar the faith traditions are. Because really, there's probably only one spiritual truth. It's just experienced and expressed in thousands of different ways.
Now, you just mentioned a dog, and this is an area of some concern because as we learn more about intelligence and what intelligence is, and as we develop robots and computers and possibly androids as sentient beings with artificial intelligence, that's maybe it's 10, 20 years away, maybe it's 100, 150 years away, but at some point in the future, unless we destroy ourselves or some alien race conquers us, we're going to have artificial intelligence. Do you think that lesser beings, if we want to use that term, like a dog, like an insect, like a paramecium, or even inanimate objects, can have some inherent purpose? Or does it take a mind and a certain level of consciousness, intellect, sentience to derive purpose or create it?
Well, you're asking me a question, Dan. I don't know. I don't know enough about the consciousness that exists among lesser animals, and I don't mean by lesser inferior, only in the sense that my little dog, he's dependent upon me, and if I just turned him loose in this world, he wouldn't survive. He really wouldn't. I don't think. Not where we are, he wouldn't survive. So that's what I mean when I say lesser. He's dependent upon me. So, but when it comes to the nature of his consciousness, I don't know. I can't say what that is. I know that my own consciousness is evolving, and so I would assume, my assumption would be, it is for lesser animals as well. But will they ever get to a place where they are self-aware? I don't know. I don't know if that time will ever come. I'm sure that for thousands of years, what has evolved into a self-conscious being that we call today the human being, there were probably centuries and centuries that maybe even thousands of years that potential human being was not self-conscious, but somewhere the shift took place. So I think that's just a part of the evolutionary nature. Things are changing, and they will always be changing. I think the bigger question is the one that you hinted at in the first of your question, this last question you just made to me, and that is, will we survive? To me, I think that is the critical question we're really facing, and I think every generation does, but I think probably ours more critically than at any other time, at least in recent history. Will the human family survive? I don't know. And frankly, it may not be such a bad thing if we don't, because we don't seem to be making the kind of progress we ought to be making in transcending even our racial and national differences, so that we look at each other as human beings. I mean, the fact that we have these Syrians, that are homeless people, and here in America, we were more bothered at a person that mistreats an animal than we are about human beings that are suffering and are homeless and are starving and hungry. Is pretty indicative that we've got some evolving to do here, and I think that that's the being and the becoming that are the critical issues that we're facing as a human family. So I don't know. I don't really know how to answer your question. I think that it's possible that the lesser animals will one day become conscious, more conscious than they are, or self-conscious. I don't know.
Let me talk about something from the world of art that would represent what some people would call weak purpose. And in science, terms like strong and weak are used. For example, the strong anthropic principle versus the weak anthropic principle, meaning things that humans are at the center of life. And as the strong anthropic principle would argue that God created the universe solely for man's benefit. The weak anthropic principle would say, well, that the universe was created for man's benefit is nice, but it wasn't the main purpose. So that's the weak thing. In the world of art, weak purpose would be, there's a thing called Chekhov's gun, that the Russian writer and playwright Anton Chekhov had this famous dictum that if you have a 3-act play and in Act 1 you see a gun on a mantelpiece, by Act 3 that gun has to go off. Otherwise, why is the gun there? In other words, it has to be used. And some people would argue, certainly a lot of religious people, and I've heard a lot of, say, fundamentalist Christians would argue, let's say that a happily married man is at work and the company he works for, in his department, they hire a new employee, and it's an attractive woman. And this woman flirts with the man, and the man has to make a choice whether he's going to have an affair or not. Now, someone would say, well, the weak purpose that this woman was hired, was that she was put there by God to test the man's fidelity to his wife, something along those lines. Whereas the strong purpose for her was that she needed a job, and she was hired here, and it had nothing to do with the man. Do you think that there are different levels of purpose such as that? And it doesn't have to necessarily be religious based, that God is testing someone, but that there can be multiple levels of purpose in an act?
Sure. I don't believe, though, given the situation you just described, that God tests anybody. I think that's a notion that a lot of religious people, and I'm probably at a time in my life when I believe the same, that every little situation in which I find myself, whether it's at work or in my family or wherever, whatever, that there is some purpose inherent in all of that that's evolving. And so, if I'm facing hard times, it's a test that God's putting me through to see if I'm going to be faithful to Him or whatever. No, I just think that, now, having said that, I do think that life, Dan, has a way we have a way of finding ourselves in the situations of life that can become tests for us. It's not that I believe that life is controlling these things, arranging the circumstances so that I go through a certain set of experiences in order to bring me to a certain place in my life, so that life is so orderly laid out like that, or predetermined, that at each stage I'm being tested to see if I'm going to successfully graduate to the next stage of my development. I don't believe that. But I do believe that wherever I am in life, that's where I am. And that challenge in that situation presents itself to me in a lot of different ways. And that I am ultimately responsible for my life and the choices I make. And that is inherent. That's where the purpose is. It's inherent in that situation. And it's not that anybody's controlled it or dictated it or arranged it. But as the scriptures, the Bible itself affirms, I can learn a lot in every situation I find myself. Where I've made mistakes, I can learn from that. Where I've made right choices, I can learn from that. And all of that, I can find purpose and meaning in all of that. It's just that I no longer believe that all of that's dictated or arranged or planned, so that God out here somewhere has this purpose that's unfolding, and He knows what I'm going to do. Well, if He knows what I'm going to do, Uh, what's the point?
Yeah.
So I just think that I don't believe that stuff anymore. Because as I said early in the interview, I don't believe that God's out there somewhere. To me, you're God. I'm God. The world is God. Everything that we see is a manifestation of whatever God is. And so that's how I live now. And I think that being at that place means that I try to treat everyone. I tried. Do I successfully do it? No. Do I still live with prejudice? Yes. Do I still struggle to let go of all of that? Of course. But that's what it means to me to be living into my humanity. It's to be free. For me, and the model for me in my faith is Jesus, because I don't believe Jesus was this divine being that was with God or was part of God or his son in the sense that I'm my father's son, and that he left that heavenly realm, wherever that is, came down and pretended to be a human being, and then died on a cross to make God happy because God was pissed off at the sin of man. I don't think that's who Jesus is or was. For me, Jesus was a man that lived, and he learned how to live fully into his own humanity to the degree that he was radically different from the world around him in that sense. And people saw in him such acceptance and love and compassion like they had never seen before, that transcended all of the barriers, racial barriers, religious barriers, national barriers, social barriers. I mean, you read the Gospel of John, and every story, as you march through that, beginning with the changing of the water to wine, the meeting of the encounter with Nicodemus at night, and the woman at the well, every one of those stories just evolved beautifully in showing how this human being lived fully into himself in that situation, and as a result was free of all the dictates that divided people. And that's what people saw in him, so that the ultimate expression of his love and compassion and acceptance was his willingness to live into his own death, so that in spite of the fact that people cursed him, he loved them. They beat him, he loved them. They nailed nails into his hands and his feet, and he loved them. And I think it's as people reflected on that reversal of expectation to the degree that they had never seen anything like it. And the truth is, we still haven't until we see it. And this is what has been so transformative in my own life. It's not that any longer that I recognize that in my teen years what a filthy sinner I am, and I beg and plead for God to forgive me, so I can go to heaven when I die, not to hell. That's not what the Christian faith is about at all. In my judgment, at this place in my life, it's about me seeing in Jesus the model for life and living, and doing my best to model my life and my compassion after that kind of life. To me, that's the purpose.
So you're not. Oh, I'm sorry. So
go ahead.
What you're basically saying is that you don't see any overarching cosmic purpose, that if there was a deity or is a deity, that the cosmos was not created as a playground to fulfill purpose, that human beings or any sentient creatures, perhaps individually or collectively, are co-creating purpose as they move through time and the cosmos?
That's exactly what I'm saying. You said it better than I said it. But that's exactly where I am. We're co-creators in a strange universities. There's many of them. I think that whatever God is, and that God is, as Paul Tillich, I think, tried to express. He's not. God is being itself. Um, he's not a being. He's not separate from this. He is this, and that you and I, as human beings, are a part of that isness. And there's not much more I can say, Dan, about that, because anything else I say then, I think, diminishes whatever God is. And to me, this is the biggest failure of religion. And it would not just be Christianity, it would be many religious traditions, is that we have reduced God now to something that we actually can control. And our theology believes we can control. So, when you think about all the stuff that you were taught as a child, all the stuff I think about that I was taught as a child, and much of which I preach to others, trying to convince them of, is just not so. Because what I was taught is that I am to pray. But as I began reflecting upon what it is I was praying about, it became quite clear to me that my prayer was really a way I was taught that prayer is what I do to talk to God. But really the motive behind that was to manipulate God, was to get God to do what I needed God to do for me. Well, that's not what prayer is to me anymore. Prayer is more like meditation, which they talk about a lot and teach a lot in the Eastern traditions. It's living into this moment. It is separating myself from the past and the future and being here now. That to me is the goal of prayer. And that is infinitely more to me than going into a hospital room, as I did with my father, who suffered this stroke, and standing at his bedside pleading with God in prayer that God bring him out of that. Why would I do that? Well, I did that because I didn't want my father to die. I still miss him 20 years later. But that was a very selfish prayer of mine. But I was taught to pray that there was something fundamental. It was like, okay, he's had a stroke. Well, where did this come from? Oh, it must be an attack from Satan. Therefore, I got to get God on my side so that we can defeat the forces of Satan and grant him healing. It's nonsensical when you think about it logically. But this is what many people have been taught to believe. So I just think we have a lot of rethinking to do and a lot of freedom that we need to grant people so that they can give up all of these fallacious quests that they're on in their religious tradition and learn to celebrate the human experience and to celebrate who they are and to live into that fully. To me, that's the most freeing part in all of my experience. And this is what I try to teach and tell other people about.
Well, we've talked about your and the collective human past and purpose, and we've also talked about what you believe now. Let me just take an eye to the future and wrap up this segment, and then we'll come back and finish the interview with some closing remarks from you. But let me ask just two questions in closing and looking towards the future. Where do you think that the purpose of humanity as a co-creators is heading? I mean, clearly, unless some cataclysm happens, we were pretty much going to be bound to leave the Earth, go to Mars, the moons of our solar system. Within 100, 200, 300 years, whatever, we'll probably develop at some point faster than light speed and go out to colonize the stars. Do you think that there's any kind of destiny or purpose for humanity in a cosmic sense to move out, to colonize, or is that just sort of human hubris?
No, I think the human destiny is if there is a grand test, and I don't believe that that's why God, whatever God is, created the universes. But if there is a test, the test is whether we are truly, as a human family, going to live into our humanness. And what that for me means is that I'm as concerned about you, Dan, as I am about myself. And that takes work. That takes a great deal of work. That I'm going to see that this little planet that we live on is all we've got right now, and so that we've got to take care of it. I understand that I can't throw trash out into the world and it not be throwing trash at myself. When I get to the place where I understand that and live from that, to me, that's the test. And so I do think it is possible that as this universe is expanding, and if the astronomers are right, and the Big Bang is the way it all started, there's probably at some point where that expansion is going to end, or going to maybe start contracting. I don't know, and maybe that's maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. Maybe the human life is in a microcosm of what's happening in the macrocosm. That I'm birthed and I reach a place where I've expanded to the degree that I start then contracting. I think that's what dying is all about. Is that we contract and then go back to what we came from. So maybe that's the way. Maybe we are microcosms of the macrocosm. Maybe that's the purpose, and that eventually it'll start, coming back in on itself. I don't know, but meanwhile, we're talking billions and billions of years. If that's true, there's a lot that can happen on this tiny little planet that we live on. So I think we keep evolving, and if we will, there is hope for us. There is a future for the human experience. That they will come when we have the technology and the knowledge and the ability to explore other universes, maybe even outside our own. I've always never forgotten, and I know we've taken a long time here, and I don't want to hold you up either, Dan, but I've always appreciated when Carl Sagan was alive, one of the things he always would say is, you Christians talk about the ascension, and Jesus, after his resurrection, ascended eventually up into the heavens and was at the right hand of God. And he would always kind of make fun of Christians, and he was nice about it, but he would raise question about the fact that however that ascension occurred, Jesus, assuming that he was traveling at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, he said, I think a lot of you Christians don't understand how vast this universe is, even this little galaxy that we live in, that Jesus, were he traveling at the speed of light, on his way to be seated at the right hand of God at his ascension, here we are 2,000 years after this supposed ascension took place, he wouldn't even be out of our little galaxy yet. He would still be traveling at the speed of light. And when he said that, I think that was the first time it dawned on me just how puny we really are, how in our theology and everything else when it comes to the human experience, and that there is so much more that we can become and live into. And our becoming is all wrapped up in that. And that as we learn to live into learning to be is our becoming.
Yeah. Let me just ask a final question, and then we'll wrap up the interview in the final segment. Human beings are mortal, we're limited, we're fallible, we're small, frail creatures, basically microbes, as you've sort of described, on this little pebble that's floating around an ember. Do you think that in the future, as humanity hopefully does expand out from the Earth and the solar system and encounters other life forms, other planets, maybe other sentient civilizations. Do you think that our own limits may just be that, and that we could possibly encounter existences, beings, conscious entities of some sort that would look at us the way we look at ants and say, "Boy, you foolish mortal, don't you understand the purpose of life is A, B, or C?" And do you think that, or do you think that even such a concept as nebulous as purpose might be, is something that's just individual, that every individual has to do that there can't be an overarching purpose, no matter how thousands or millions of times more intelligent a individual may be?
Well, you asked me, Dan, about an overall general purpose of life, and I'm not in any way wishing to avoid your question. I just don't know.
Okay.
And I think that there might be. I don't know that I will ever know it. I don't know how I would find that out. So there's certain things that I just trust. I just trust that it's okay as it is. It is as it is.
Okay.
And to me, that's what biblical trust or faith is all about. Faith is not a collection of beliefs. A collection of beliefs can express your faith, but it's not faith. Because faith to me is not like a glass, like this cup, and inside the coffee, now it's down to about a third a cup. And that's faith in there, and that as I get more faith in there, as if it's something I can collect, then I'll understand these things better. No, I think faith is learning to trust what I cannot change or do anything about, and just trust that it's going to be okay. It's going to evolve. It's going to be fine. And as I learn to live from that place, that's free. So I don't know what the grand scheme of things, I don't know how all that's going to evolve. I do think that it's very possible. In fact, I think it's probable that there is intelligence in other universes, maybe in our own galaxy. I don't know. I just think that in time, if we survive, we're going to know. So the conditions that have to exist, it seems to me, for human survival. Number one, we must all move toward greater and greater consciousness as one human family. That's one thing. If that happens, and right now the goofball in North Korea can come to a place in his life where this is how he thinks. If our own leaders can get to a place where this is how they think, and if you and I can get to a place where this is how we live and so behave and treat the world, then I think there's hope for a future. A second thing is we need freedom to continue to explore and advance in our knowledge. We don't need to be inhibited by our fears and restricted belief systems that assume, that to tamper in these things is to become God. We've got to get beyond that. And as long as we can't get beyond that, then it's going to be a constant battle, which is what we see happening in our world today. And so I think those are the two conditions that have to exist for the human experience to continue and for the human family to evolve.
Well, let's end this segment here. In the final segment, I'll give you a few minutes to just have some closing remarks, and we'll do that when we return. I have been speaking with Steve McSwain. SteveMcSwain.com is his website. He has written a number of books on life, on spirituality. I've been talking with him for the past a little over an hour about the nature of purpose. And let me just give you a couple of minutes to wrap up any final thoughts that you have on the idea and the nature of purpose, both for human beings and for reality.
Well, thank you, Dan. It's been my pleasure to be in conversation with you. I think maybe in closing, what I would say to your listeners or viewers is that there are two things in life that to me are important. One is that you and I not confuse who we are with who we're really not. And I think it took me a long time in my life to get to this place where I did not confuse the image I saw in a mirror with who I am. What I was doing in my life with my principal purpose as a human being. That my name, my occupation, all these things are only expressions of who I am. And being able to separate that from the real me, the deeper me, whatever that is one of the things that I think the Buddha was talking about when he talked about the nature of reality. And for a long time in my life, I defined myself by my name, my tradition, my association with my parents, my body, my thoughts. And so I would think a thought, think that was me. Or I would see myself in the mirror as I prepped and got ready for the day's activities and confused that image, kind of what Albert Einstein said, that's an optical illusion in consciousness. We confuse the image we see with who we are. And I think where this really came clear to me was, you remember a few years ago that lady up in Connecticut who was mauled by the chimp.
Yeah.
And, her neighbor had a chimpanzee and it got loose and she saw it through her front window that was out in the street, and she ran out. She knew the chimp, had been around the chimp, but suddenly, and for some strange reason, the chimp turned on her and nearly killed her, ripped her face off, pulled her hands off, or bit her hands off, and she nearly died. She went through a number of surgeries, and then she was the first person in American medical history to successfully survive a facial transplant. Because the chimp ripped her face, bit her face right off, and her eyes and everything, pulled them right out of their socket. So I remember reading the story as she had this successful transplant of her face, and that's when it hit me. So you just try to imagine the first 30 years of your life. Every time you looked at yourself in a mirror, you're looking at yourself, you think. And then suddenly the next half of your life, you're looking at somebody else. So the question then becomes, who are you? And so I think that we're constantly confused. So the first thing that I would say to people is, if you want to find out the real purpose of human existence, you got to start there. Figure out who you really are beyond all the trappings of self-definition. That's the first thing. Second thing, and in closing, I would say that once you've made that discovery, then the second thing is you can begin to live your life then into the fullness of who you believe you are. And as you do that, the joy of living and life becomes more and more real to you, because you're free of the trappings of defining yourself by your degrees, your accomplishments, your trophies. You've detached yourself from those. They certainly are important, and they are nice memories to have, and they're wonderful things to put on the trophy case, in the trophy case for your family to remember you by. But it ultimately is not who you are. And that if you really want to find out the purpose of life, enter the quest to make that discovery, and that'll be the greatest journey that you've ever embarked upon.
Well, SteveMcSwain.com is Steve's website. I'll have a link below this video. Anyone who's enjoyed my discussion with him can find out more by clicking there and going to his website. So I just wanted to thank you for spending an hour or more with me talking about these things, Steve.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.